Our reading this morning is from 1 Samuel and chapter 8. 1 Samuel and chapter 8, commencing to read at verse 1. And it came to pass, when Samuel was old, that he made his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abiah. They were judges in Beersheba. And his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes, and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together, and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, Behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel, when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, Hearken unto the voice of the people, in all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. According to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them out of Egypt, even unto this day, wherewith they have forsaken me, and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. And Samuel told all the words of the Lord unto the people that asked of him a king. And I underlined in my Bible what it was going to cost them. It was going to cost them a lot. And he said in verse 11, This shall be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons. And you notice what all is going to be taken here. And appoint them to himself for his chariots and to be his horsemen, and some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over fifties, and will set them to ear his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants, and your goodliest young men, and your asses, and put them to his work. And he will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants, and ye shall cry out in that day because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you. And the Lord will not hear you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said unto all the men of Israel, Go ye every man unto his city. And may God bless his word to our hearts this morning. We were singing there in our previous hymn, Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by your help we've come. On last Lord's Day we were dwelling on the two words, Ebenezer, hitherto hath the Lord helped us, and we were looking at the great battle that was going to take place between the Israelites and the Philistines. We also dwelt upon the word Mizpah, which we reminded ourselves simply means, The Lord watch between me and thee, whenever we're absent one from another. I want to speak today, and I know that our children's story has made reference to it already, about disappointments. And today, if I was looking for a title for chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, I would talk about Samuel's disappointments. And I want you to notice later on the lessons that he was going to learn, not only about himself and about the people, but also about God. That in the midst of his disappointments, he was able to go to God and bring everything to God in prayer. Samuel, unlike any before him, and only one after him, held three different offices. Those offices was that of being a prophet, of being a priest, and also being a judge. Now, whenever Samuel was a judge, the judges of Israel, that we've looked at a couple of years ago, the judge's responsibility was to interpret and to apply the law. And this work had occupied most of Samuel's life, but not all of his life. The judges were responsible whenever people were going out to war. They were responsible to lead their armies into the battle. In the book of Judges, and I know that we have dwelt upon these judges in the past, we have a fine example of some men that God mightily used in the book of Judges. There was Othniel, there was Ehud, there was Gideon, there was Jephthah, and we could go on and mention many others. But we read in the book of Judges, whenever they were going out to the war, they were carrying weapons whenever they were heading out to war. I understand that there was no fixed term for that of being the judge. There are some of the judges, and they only served for a few years, whereas there were those like Samuel that remained in the office for a long, long time. We're told in chapter 7 and verse 15 that Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He came to leadership as a young man, and he laid down the work of leadership whenever he was now old. And so Samuel, we're told, he was a judge, he was also a priest. He set up an altar in his hometown of Ramah, and there he offered sacrifices and prayed for the people to secure the blessings of heaven. This was his priestly work, but still it was not all the work that Samuel was involved in. The role of the priest was to establish courts in Bethel and in Gilgal and in Mizpah, and each year he would go and he would visit these three places and he would administer the law of God. God's law is unchanging. You listen to the news this week, you listen to people like David Cameron and Nick Clegg, who are telling us that in Britain we have reached a great stage in the history of Britain whenever there's new laws have been brought in. But I tell you, dear friend, that still does not do away with the true laws of God. Now, where we break into the story of Samuel, Samuel is now classed as an older man. In verse 1 we read, "And it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel." I do not know what you class as old today. Probably if you were in your 30s, you probably class somebody in their 50s as old. Maybe if you're in your 90s, you maybe class somebody as 100 that is being old. Because very often it falls down into whatever bracket that our lifespan seems to be in. But Samuel has reached the age of about 70. Now, I reckon today, 70, of course, is not classed as old any longer. And there's still a tremendous work for Samuel to do and to accomplish. But what has happened is, nature teaches us that a man of 70 does not have the same zeal. We use the term nowadays, too many birthdays. He does not have the same zeal, the same determination as that of a younger man. I remember my late father, who was an extremely strong man. He certainly was. And one day I happened to watch one of my brothers who was trying to catch a bullock. And my father was watching. He hadn't the energy and the strength that he once had. And he stood there and he says, "Boys, I wish I was back in my 40s again." Because that's when the strength seemed to be there. But common sense tells us that a 70-year-old man does not have the same gist, the same go. He may have, the spirit may be willing, but the flesh can be weak. And yet, on the other hand, a 70-year-old man could put many a 30-year-old man to shame. And I'm sure that is true. But as Samuel begins to slow down, he discovers that the work that he is called into, the work of being a prophet, a priest and a judge, it is too great for him now. And so he does something. He appoints his sons to leadership. And we're told here in this passage that in verse 3, and his sons then, that they walked not in his ways. You see, I want you to get the background. Samuel is now 70. Now, I believe, and I've spoken to many people over the years, it's always difficult in any role to hand over the reins. It's always difficult. And people, I'm sure, do not do it lightly. But Samuel has reached this stage in his life where he realizes it's time that I was handing over the reins to the next generation. And so he's 70 years or thereabouts. There's many important events that are behind him in his life, but there's many crucial events that are ahead of him. He has still several years of ministry left. He has still got some responsible jobs to do. He's got to anoint David and he's got to anoint Samuel as kings. Now in chapter 8 and verse 2 tells us about his sons, that he called his firstborn Joel. The name of the second was called Abiah. This was the day whenever there was a tremendous emphasis that was placed on the names that were given to children. The name Joel just means Yahweh is my God. The name Abiah means my father is Yahweh. And so here was a man here, and whenever his sons were born, there's a great expression in these names, and there's a great meaning in them. But we're told that Samuel saw himself both as being a child and as a servant of God, but he has reached this stage in his life. Now this chapter, I would say, stresses to us that God still uses older people. Where would we be today in the work of God if it wasn't for older people? Now, I was visiting the other day an old, retired minister. I imagine he calls himself, he probably does, old now. And he was saying to me, he says, you know, I'm a little bit like John Wesley of old, whenever Wesley wrote in his diary that he has no problem reminding things 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 60 years ago. The problem is remembering things that has happened recently. And of course that is usually the way. The long-term memory is so good and so clear, but the short-term, it begins to get affected with age. Now Samuel is probably going to live to around 100 years or so. I want to read a little poem that I read, and it's entitled, I'm Not Growing Old. And I have to laugh sometimes to myself, because maybe someone that maybe I've contact with, and maybe they're in their 80s, and or thereabouts, and maybe someone has passed away. And just as it happened to me recently there too, again, whenever this person said to me, well, so-and-so, whenever they died, they were a fine old age. But the problem was they were older themselves. You see, sometimes we live in a state of denial. The person who was telling me this was well on in years. The one that had died were a number of years younger, but they didn't seem to see it that way. But this poem goes like this here, I'm not growing old. And it starts, you tell me I'm growing old. I tell you that's not true. The house I live in is worn out, and that, of course, I know. It's been in use a long while. It's weathered many a gale. I'm really not surprised you think it's getting somewhat frail. And you look at the house, the case that mixes up. And the poet goes like this here, the colour's changing on my roof. I remember I had a minister in our house one day, and he said that he had autumn on his head and he had spring in his heart. Well, it goes on, the colour's changing on my roof. The window's getting dim. The wall's a bit transparent and looking rather thin. The foundation's not so steady as once it used to be. My house is getting shaky, but my house isn't me. My few short years can't make me old. I feel I'm in my youth. Eternity lies just ahead, a life of joy and truth. You only see the outside, which is all that most folks see. You tell me I'm getting old. You've mixed my house with me. And The house, our bodies, is just the old case that is carrying with us what will live on throughout the realms of eternity. God used Abraham whenever Abraham was very old. God used Paul whenever he was very old. God used Moses whenever he was very old. And I suppose the old saying goes, you're as young as you feel. Well, I want you to learn some lessons here from Samuel. And one very important lesson that I think that Samuel probably learned. Remember, he was not infallible. And that's this here, that old leaders who have been used of God throughout their lives can make foolish decisions. We've only to look at the story of the old backslidden prophet in the Old Testament to know that he made a foolish decision. I'll say that again. Old leaders who have been used of God throughout their lives can make foolish decisions. What was Samuel's? Samuel was that he made such a choice whenever he selected his ungodly sons to be judges. That was a great mistake. You see, it's hard to see here, not to see here, a similar situation with that of Eli. You remember the story of Eli with his sons Hophni and Phinehas? That Eli did not rebuke his sons whenever they became vile. But what do we see now? We see history repeating itself, and we have Samuel, an old man, and his sons are not walking in God's ways. And Samuel selects his sons to be judges in Israel. You see, in Samuel's case, Samuel chose his sons. He selected his sons. He set aside his sons that they would become judges. In the case of Eli, his sons, it was an hereditary office. Now, I think it's fair to say about Samuel that the text does suggest to us that the evil nature of his sons had only showed up really after they'd been given a position of power. Because verse 3 tells me, and his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside. They turned aside. We've often said over the years, dear friends, salvation does not run in the blood. Good fathers reared bad sons in the past, and I'm sure that will always be. And sometimes bad sons made very good fathers. And it's the same whenever it comes to the opposite sex. Good mothers can rear very, very bad daughters, and vice versa. I know a dear case there recently of a heartbroken couple who buried a wayward daughter. And it was heartbreaking to bury a daughter, a young daughter that had no interest whatsoever in the things of God, was taught the Scriptures, but grew up and had no interest in spiritual things. And so we have to be very slow sometimes to point the finger, because we do not know whenever the tide turns and things go completely wrong. And so what we find was that the main problem here with Samuel's action was that he had no divine authority for what he did. He selected his sons. I tell you, dear friends, it's very easy for us, and we often say it to have one standard for ourselves and another standard for somebody else. Very easy for us whenever we want to justify our own lifestyle to say, well, that's me. But whenever it comes to somebody else as a different standard, perhaps they're judged with. You see, Samuel here, he has no divine authority for selecting his sons. The decision Samuel made had long-term consequences that would never have happened had Samuel not made this foolish decision. Now, I know there's a verse in the Bible, I've looked at it in the past, it troubles many a person, and that is about the sins of the fathers being carried unto the third and to the fourth generations. That's a very serious verse. That's a verse that has great consequences. But there's some lessons that we can learn from this passage of Samuel. I want you, dear friends, to get it today. Samuel's about 70. He hasn't the same zeal as he once had. Naturally, of course, that would be. He goes and he selects these sons for office without asking God who should be in office. Remember, Samuel was only a man. And I'm glad whenever we read the Scriptures that the Scripture gives us warts and all. The Scripture doesn't present to us a picture of a superhuman being here. No, it doesn't. You see, a lifetime of service can result in disappointment. Samuel has spent his life in seeking to bring the nation back to God. And in a measure he had seen some fruit. He had seen the national repentance at Mizpah that we looked at last Lord's Day. But here he sees the people rejecting God. Samuel's very, very disappointed. He's disappointed with the behaviour of his sons, and he's also disappointed with the beliefs of his people. You see, dear friends, it's worth noticing here that though Samuel had made a wrong decision and was still experiencing disappointments, he goes to the place of prayer. Now, I don't know, maybe you're in this meeting today and you are disappointed. And I certainly, over the years, have met mothers that were very disappointed. Over the years, I've met mothers who have told me that if they met their daughters on the main street, even of Cookstown, their daughter would cross to the other side of the street. I've met mothers that has no contact with their children, some for 20 years or over it. And that's sad. I've met fathers in the same boat, where they were rejected by their children. And here we find that in Samuel's life there's this disappointment. I wonder, maybe you're in our service this morning and you're disappointed. And maybe everything has not worked out the way that you've anticipated. And dear friends, we better be aware that in this big world of ours, that we will face sooner or later, we'll face disappointments. Disappointments with others, disappointments sometimes with ourselves. But if we're prepared for that, well, then it will not have as big a knock on us. Paul experienced a great disappointment whenever Demas turned aside because he had a love for the present world. You see, it's worth noticing here that Samuel has made this wrong decision, but remember that he's going to go to God in prayer. Verse 6 tells me, but the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. Samuel has the burden of his sons. He has the burden now of the people. But he's going to take his disappointments to God. Someone has said this here, if we take the word disappointments and we drop the first letter, the letter D, and we put the letter H in front of it, what we have instead of disappointments, we have his appointments. And sometimes in our midst of disappointments, God can speak to us and God can guide us and God can show us many, many things. You see, you could be in the Lord's house this morning. You could be disappointed with someone. Someone could be disappointed with me. You could be disappointed with yourself. You could be disappointed with your circumstances. There may be dashed hopes. And very often it is in the course of life that one disappointment will come after another. It was like that in the case of Job. It was like that in the case of Joseph. And so Samuel, first of all, he's disappointed with his sons. You remember the message was very clear about Eli. I tell you, dear friends, sometimes as parents we've got to keep our mouths shut. Sometimes as parents we've got to keep it sealed, because things can change. Remember, God's judgment has fallen on Hophni and Phinehas, and Eli, he falls back as a man of 90 or so, and his neck is broken, and that was the end of Eli's earthly life. But now we have this similar situation. Samuel's sons, well, they're not walking in his ways and the ways of God. He's rejected then eventually by the ones that he laboured to help. They come to Samuel and they say, look, Samuel, this is too much for you now. It's time for you to move on. But I want you to notice as we pass through that God answers Samuel's prayer. Prayer did several things for Samuel. Prayer provided God's guidance on how to respond to the elders' request whenever the elders were going to come to him in verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and they came to Samuel unto Ramah. And that was a yearly visit. And they said unto him, Thou art old, and thy sons are not walking in the right way. And so now we're looking for a king. I believe that prayer gave to him a measure of encouragement. God reminds Samuel that the people have not actually rejected Samuel as such, but the people have rejected God. Now in verses 4 and 5, Samuel, this old man, he has lived in public life for many years. The people would make this pilgrimage to his home in Ramah to thank him for what he has done and to show him in a measure so much that he so richly deserved. But then on this visit, things are different. The elders of Israel come along to offer the sacrifice, but instead of bringing to Samuel respect, they bring to him grief. Now, part of what they were saying was right. Samuel was getting too old for the job. So that was right enough. But there was still much work that God wanted Samuel to do. The other side of the story was his sons were accepting bribes. That was true enough. You see, I like the story there, the children's story of George Mueller. That whenever he finished in prison, he had to learn that lesson. Wouldn't his father have been a very foolish man to have stood up and said, well, poor little George, he's not a bad cub after all, and we'll justify it all. But no. He wasn't going to go down that route. As I say, sometimes we can have a two-standard approach. You see, what is really their motive is here whenever they come to Samuel is they want an end of his judgeship, the office that he has occupied for all his life. They're tired of the judges. They want the judges to be a thing of the past because for over 200 years the judges had served Israel. They had saved the Israelites from the Amorites, from the Hittites, from the Jebusites. And I want you to notice that though God had saved them by the judges, they were sick and tired of the men and of the God who sent them. They said, no, we don't want this any longer. They want a king. And so they come to Samuel and they say, look, Samuel, you're too old for the job. Your sons aren't walking right. We're tired of the judges and we want a king now to rule over us. You see in verse 5, the people said, behold, thou art old. And the latter part, now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. And we could lay emphasis this morning on that aspect, like all the nations. You see, in itself, the desire wasn't wrong whenever they were seeking a king. Because in Deuteronomy 17 we're told that one day God would give them a king, and if the king was loyal to the law, he and the people would prosper. But if the request wasn't sinful, the motive that lay behind it certainly was. They want a king, just like the other nations. Wonder if you ever read through, I'm sure you have, the book of Leviticus. I never find it the easiest book to read through. I find sometimes that whenever you read into the sacrifices and all, there's so many laws and that it gets so complicated sometimes. I don't fully understand it all. I'm not professing that I do. But have you ever read in the book of Leviticus all the weird, unusual laws that there was under the Levitical law? Tells us, of course, some of those laws were sensible. Whenever you built a house, you were to build a balcony around the house so that nobody that was upstairs in the balcony would topple off the balcony onto the ground. Now today we would say that would be common sense, but that was law. That was one of the laws that was to be adhered to. Then there was the laws, unusual laws, weird laws we would say, where the seamstress, she couldn't use two kinds of fabric in the same garment. And so most of you today, I don't know what you do, but if ever I was buying something, the first thing I look at is the label. And maybe that's because I worked in the rag trade for a while, for 4 years. But I look to see what the mixture is. Is this a wool mixture? Is this just polyester? Or is this man-made fibres? Or what is it? But you see, in the old law, you couldn't mix two kinds of fabric in the same garment. And so if you were wearing wool and cotton, that wasn't allowed under the old law. If you were a farmer in the book of Leviticus and you were planting two kinds of seeds, you couldn't do it in the same field. It wasn't allowed. Even in the flower garden, you couldn't grow two flowers together. They had to be separate. Maybe that's been Mother's Sunday, you've been getting your flowers and that. Well, under the Levitical law, you couldn't have mixed flowers. They had to be all one or the other. You weren't allowed to mix it. Now, why was it that the Lord gives such strange rules to the people? You can't plant two types of seeds in the garden or in the field. You can't mix any materials whenever you're making the clothes. You can't do so many things. Was the Lord looking just to confuse the people, or was God looking to do that? Was it because that He wanted life to be very hard and difficult for the people? No, it was to teach them a lesson. They must be separate from other nations. They must be different. You see, what it was really being said here, if all other nations have kings, let them have them, but Israel is not another nation. In Deuteronomy 14:2, for thou art a holy people unto the Lord thy God, and the Lord hath chosen thee to be a peculiar people unto Himself above all the nations that are upon the earth. They were to be a separate people. You see, this was another way of the people saying to Samuel, look, Samuel, we're tired here. The problem is that we want to live more by sight rather than by faith. And so if we have a king who will judge us and a king who will rule over us, we'll be like the same other nations. We'll always have the king. But Samuel's very disappointed. He's very disappointed. You see, the problem with the judges was that you had to wait for God to appoint the judge and to send one. You had to trust Him to do that. On the other hand, whenever there was the king would always be there. And if the king died, his son then would step into office, usually. And what the lesson is here, that it's easier to trust a God you can see than the God you can't see. And so what's the lessons that we can learn from chapter 8? We can learn, dear friend, that this man Samuel, the man that holds 3 offices, that whenever we're old, we can make foolish decisions. Oh, we could say this morning, whenever we're young, we make foolish decisions. Samuel, remember, had no divine authority to appoint his sons. We use that old saying sometimes, blood's thicker than water. Did you ever hear that saying? Well, Samuel was wrong. His sons, they go after the lucre, they take bribes, and they perverted judgment. And then the elders said, look, Samuel, you're too old for this job. What do we read? We read that Samuel, in verse 6, but the thing displeased Samuel, and they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. What did the Lord say to Samuel? And with this I'm through. The Lord said to Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people, and all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Is it not sometimes true that even in our own little land here and in our nation, we have to look beyond things and say that the people, so many, are rejecting God? And as I say, you have people like the Prime Minister and all hopping on the hobby horse blatantly, setting aside the Word of God, going their own way. Who are they really rejecting? It's the God of heaven. Next week, God willing, or it'll be 2 weeks, all been well, I want us to notice Samuel's reaction to all this here. Samuel says to them, well, look here, there's going to be a cost whenever God gives you kings. He's going to take your sons. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to take so many of the things that you own. He'll take your fields, He'll take your vineyards, He'll take your servants, He'll take your tenth, He'll take everything. There was the consequences. You know, the Word of God tells me that God gave them their request. Speaking about the children of Israel, He gave them their request, but He sent leanness into their souls. May God bless His Word to our hearts today.